I want to take a few minutes to talk about the current debate over the fiscal year 2016 budget. Isn't it wonderful that we have a budget that we've reported to the floor? Something we haven't had for, I think it's been the last 5 years under Democrat leadership. Naturally, there are differences between both sides, but it's great that we are using this budget process, and hopefully we will pass this budget and go on from there. The House is going to pass its, so I appreciate what they're trying to do over there as well. First and foremost, I want to thank the chairman of the Budget Committee for all his hard work in putting this product together. He's done great work in producing a budget that I believe most senators can support, and also in finding a way to navigate some pretty treacherous minefields along the way. Let's look at just some of what Senator Enzi's budget will accomplish. The most striking thing about this budget is that it balances in the 10-year window, eventually reaching a $3 billion surplus. This shouldn't be all that surprising, Mr. President, but given our nation's recent budgetary history, to some it is. President Obama likes to brag about all the deficit reduction that's taken place under his administration. Yet the president has yet to send a balanced budget to Congress. And more often than not, his claims of deficit reduction are measured against an inflation baseline that routinely ignores the fact that almost all of the reduction can be attributed to increased revenues extracted from hardworking American taxpayers, with precious little coming in the way of any spending cuts. The Senate Republican budget prepared by the chairman of the Budget Committee would achieve $4.4 trillion more in deficit reduction than President Obama's most recent budget proposal. Now, this is a statement about fiscal policy, Mr. President, with the recognition that now is the time to get our nation's fiscal house in order. The budget accomplishes its objectives in a number of ways, most notably by providing a path toward reining in our unsustainable entitlement programs. Let's keep in mind that when we're talking about our entitlements, Medicare, Medicaid, and Social Security in particular, just to mention a few, we're talking about tens of trillions of dollars in unfunded liabilities over the long term. These ever-growing programs have us on a path toward a fiscal crisis that threatens to swallow up our government and take our economy down with it. The Senate Republican budget would allow us to begin to tackle each of these programs' shortfalls, offsetting much of the deficits and giving policymakers in Congress and the administration more room to work toward lasting solutions to these problems. With each of these three major programs, the budget would help stave off fiscal calamity and give us a real opportunity for long-term reforms. Entitlement reform is one of the great causes of our time, Mr. President. If we're serious about bringing down deficits and debt and ensuring the solvency of our safety net programs, we cannot continue to kick the proverbial can down the road. I've been disappointed with each of President Obama's budgets, none of which would make a dent in our entitlement programs. This budget before us this week would enable us to begin the process of finding long-term fixes to these programs to ensure Medicare, Medicaid, and Social Security still exist in the future for our children and our grandchildren. In addition to putting our government on a more fiscally sustainable path, this budget would support strong economic growth and job creation. Most notably, it contains a reserve fund designed specifically for this purpose, which includes, among other things, lowering the cost of investment, reducing the cost to businesses and individuals from the Internal Revenue Code, creating a competitive finance sector, and improving congressional budgetary scorekeeping. And of course, the budget gives us a path forward on repealing the so-called Affordable Care Act, which continues to be an albatross on our economy and on the well-being of hardworking taxpayers. And I don't see how anybody can make out a case that that's not going to take us right into real difficulties financially. And it isn't going to work either. The budget specifically includes a repeal of Obamacare's tax on medical devices. Hey, there's one for you. They needed $30 billion more, so they just put in, let's sock a gross sales tax on sales for all medical device companies. That's something I've been totally opposed to, and the repeal of the Obamacare tax on medical devices is something I've been pushing for since the law was first enacted. And sooner or later, we're going to win on that because it's got to be taken care of. This budget does. You recall, Mr. President, that an overwhelming majority of senators, 79 to be exact, voted to repeal this tax the last time we debated a budget in this chamber. So I should not be the one who's pleased to see this particular provision or be the only one who's pleased to see this particular provision included in the budget. The budget also includes provisions specifically to repeal the individual and employer mandates, causes that I've also championed here in the Senate. And like I said, Mr. President, Senator Enzi and his fellow members of the committee deserve a lot of credit for the work that he and they have done thus far in the budget, and I'm very pleased to offer my support. I'm aware that given the partisan climate that we're working in, this budget has some detractors on the other side of the aisle. As I've listened to their arguments against the budget over the past few days, one thing has become pretty clear. My Democratic friends haven't come up with any new arguments in a long time. Rather than constructive proposals to help address our nation's fiscal difficulties, our friends on the other side of the aisle are content to simply continue pretending that raising taxes is a fix-all elixir for all of our budgetary problems. Indeed, they've continued with the tired, debunked talking points arguing that every problem will be solved if Republicans will simply allow for modest tax hikes on the so-called rich. How many times have we heard that? Yet even though our debt as a share of our economy is at levels not seen since the years surrounding World War II, it is most often the case that when my friends call for more taxes, often under the guise of closing unspecified, quote, loopholes, unquote, they want to immediately spend it, ignoring the pile of debt that the current administration has accumulated. We've been through that over and over. It's time for the American people to wake up and realize what they're doing to us. And this budget helps us to understand that better. Mr. President, I'd wager the few reasonable people if put on the spot would seriously argue that the American people are undertaxed. Yet if you hear the arguments coming from the other side, that appears to be their position. And yet we're taxed at the highest percentage of the total budget that we've ever been. So we've heard our colleagues lament the lack of tax hikes in Chairman Enzi's budget. And we've already had some votes on amendments to raise taxes. What we have not heard, however, is a plan that would line up all of my colleagues' spending priorities, which are vast and numerous, with enough tax hikes to cover the cost. Until my friends on the other side of the aisle either produce such a plan or acknowledge that there are not enough palatable tax hikes out there to pay for all the spending they support, no one should take their arguments against the budget seriously. Now, let me just point to this chart. Let's take a look at this chart right here. By my staff's reckoning, if you look at all the tax hikes my friends on the other side of the aisle put to a vote in the last Congress, including the so-called Buffett rule, taxes on corporate jets and oil and gas and others, they are on the record for supporting about $69 billion in specific tax hikes that have not yet been enacted into law. Yet the first Democratic amendment to this budget purported to raise taxes by $478 billion. That's $408 billion more than what my friends on the other side have specified in the recent past. Now, what does that mean? The Sanders Amendment, which we voted on yesterday and almost all Democrats supported, essentially proposed to raise taxes by over $400. Over $400 billion with unspecified tax policy. Perhaps my Democratic friends would care to tell the American people how they propose to raise that $400 billion in additional revenue, where the tax hikes will come, and who's going to get hit by them? I will not be holding my breath waiting for an answer. So the Senate Democrats' revenue raisers well is almost dry, almost completely dry, if you look at it. Revenue necessary for spending, the increase $478 billion. The Buffett rule, $151 billion. The oil and gas, $16 billion. The tax compliance, they say, is $4.28 billion. You can get down the whole thing, and the total offsets $69.5 billion. That's a new bill. That's the total offsets that they're talking about. It's unbelievable to me. Like I said, Mr. President, there are definitely people who want to criticize this budget, but when it comes to taxes and revenues, the critics just don't have a leg to stand on. Now, I'd like to talk for just a few moments about an amendment to the budget that I plan to offer this week. My amendment addresses the need for comprehensive tax reform. The budget already includes a deficit-neutral reserve fund for tax reform and administration. My amendment would add more detail to this fund to fully describe what our tax reform efforts should look like. Specifically, it would make clear that tax reform should be comprehensive and address individual, business, and international provisions of the tax code. It would also state that our reform efforts should be aimed at creating a tax code that is more efficient, pro-growth, fair, and simple. It would put in place other principles for reform as well, namely permanence, competitiveness, and promoting savings and investment. It would set forth goals to reduce income tax rates while remaining revenue neutral. And as most of my colleagues know, Mr. President, I've been advocating for tax reform for some time now. This amendment would set this effort off on the right path. I'll have other priorities to discuss when it comes to this budget. I look forward to working with my colleagues to get them adopted. Now, Mr. President, the Senate is doing good work with this budget. It is thankfully working to fulfill its responsibilities. Once again, I want to thank our distinguished chairman of the Budget Committee for his efforts on the budget. And I urge all my colleagues in the Senate to join me in supporting this product. Now, I ask that my remaining remarks be placed in an appropriate place in the record.
Without objection.
Thank you, Mr. President. I want to take a few minutes to talk about the House's ongoing efforts to replace the Medicare Sustainable Growth Rate, or SGR, formula. As we all know, the House is poised to pass legislation that would permanently repeal and replace the SGR with an improved payment system that rewards quality, efficiency, and innovation. This bipartisan exercise represents what Congress is truly capable of when members decide to set aside their differences and work together. Since SGR first went into effect, Congress has continually acted to prevent its reimbursement cuts from taking place. This has meant numerous and repetitive SGR patches, usually cobbled together at the last minute behind closed doors, much to the tremendous concern of our physicians throughout this country. For years, this cycle has bothered members of Congress from both parties. That's why over 2 years ago, former Finance Committee Chairman Max Baucus and I set out to fix this problem once and for all on the Senate side. People said it was a lost cause and that our efforts were doomed from the beginning. But in late 2013, we introduced our legislation and got it reported out of the Finance Committee on a voice vote. That bill, which was also drafted with the input and support of the leaders on the relevant committees in the House of Representatives, formed the basis for the legislation the House will be voting on this week. They deserve a lot of credit for this. It has taken a lot of work to get to this point, and we're not there yet. But we're getting close, Mr. President. We just need to finish the job. The House bill is important for a number of reasons. Yes, it includes the plan to repeal and replace the broken SGR system. And I think everybody around here really would like to do that. But there's more to it. The bill also includes a 2-year extension of CHIP, the Child Health Insurance Program that Senator Kennedy and I put through a number of years ago, and a temporary extension of key Medicare extenders that need immediate congressional action. This will give the relevant committees time to reform these programs in a responsible manner. It also includes provisions to strengthen Medicare's ability to fight fraud and bolster existing program integrity efforts. And most importantly, the bill includes a down payment on entitlement reform without any tax hike. For years, members of Congress have been pushing for legislative fixes that will help rein in our unsustainable entitlement programs to ensure that they're around for future generations. I personally have been working very hard on this effort. In 2013, I put forward the separate reform proposals to Medicare and Medicaid that were designed to be bipartisan in hopes that I could jumpstart the conversation on entitlement reform. I shared those proposals with anyone who would listen, and even some, including President Obama, who would not. Today, I'm happy to say that 2 of those ideas, the limitation on the so-called Medigap first dollar coverage, or more robust means testing for Medicare Parts B and D, are included in the House's SGR bill. For years, the idea of bipartisan Medicare reform seemed like a pipe dream, particularly as President Obama and his allies in Congress demanded that any changes to the program be coupled with significant tax hikes. But here we are, just a few votes away from enacting meaningful Medicare reforms into law. I want to commend Speaker Boehner and Minority Leader Pelosi for their efforts to reach this bipartisan deal on this legislation. They both deserve a lot of credit, as do those who are voting for this over in the House. In addition to the leaders of the relevant committees, their work and their willingness to set aside partisanship for the greater good have been vital to this effort. This has not been easy by any stretch of the imagination. It was also encouraging to hear today that President Obama says he intends to sign the bill. Think about that. Specifically, he said about this SGR legislation, quote, "I've got my pen ready to sign a good bipartisan bill," unquote. I commend him for that. It's my understanding that an official statement of administration policy will be forthcoming. This is super. This is something that we ought to all applaud and be ready to do. Now, I'm not here to say that the House bill is perfect. Of course it's not. And I'm aware that some of my colleagues here in the Senate are hesitant to support this package and have made public statements indicating as much. Ultimately, I think anyone who is looking for a reason to vote no on the House bill could probably dig through it and find something to oppose. This is true of any bill of this magnitude, especially in a divided government. And although I do have to say that some of the straw man arguments raised over the past week or so against this legislation have been interesting to say the least, I know there are senators who have in their minds a vision of what for them would be an ideal solution for SGR, CHIP, or any of the other parts of this legislation. Indeed, I have my own thoughts as to how I'd like to improve this bill. But I've been around long enough to know that anyone who waits around for a perfect bill better be prepared to wait for a very, very long time. We've waited long enough for a solution on SGR. It's time to get this done. This is a good bill, and it's coming at the right time. The time to act is now. I can't imagine another bipartisan opportunity like this coming around again anytime soon, and I've been informed by members of the House that this is the last time they're going to increase SGR and take care of it. So we gotta take this and get it through. Anyone who thinks we can continue to put this off, to wait around for the perfect bill to come together, is fooling themselves. Make no mistake, if we don't do this now, we're looking at many more years of last-minute costly SGR patches, and I've been told the House is through. They've done their job, and it may be a long time before you can get another patch, which means that we've got to do the job here, or every physician in this country's going to hate everybody in this Senate. Well, they shouldn't hate everybody. There's some of us who are really pushing hard to get this done. Let's get this done, Mr. President. And I hope that all my colleagues will support the House's SGR package, especially if it's as big a vote as I've been indicating here today. I think it will be a big vote. I think they deserve a lot of credit. It solves some problems that we couldn't otherwise solve. It also makes some good changes to some of our entitlement programs that are long overdue. So I want to commend Speaker Boehner and Minority Leader Pelosi and others who are helping to get this done. I want to commend them for the work that they're doing. Mr. Chairman, I yield the floor.